Happy 2020, everybody, and the last people on the planet that I expected to give the world a New Year's Day present would be the People's Republic of China. Of course, this present comes with quite a number of strings attached, but it has created a new race to the moon, a race that I hope the Western world will react to, although thus far, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people in the government that recognize this move for what it is. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what's happened as of late, the People's Republic of China have announced that they are moving up their moon base schedule to 2027. That's right, they intend to have a permanent manned presence on the moon in just 5 years. It seems impossible, but at the same time, they've also laid out a very solid plan to accomplish this, and I am not a huge betting man, but I would bet on them succeeding. Now, as you will see in the rest of this video, there are many reasons that I think that China will succeed in this endeavor, but the main reason, in my opinion, is the fact that they have a new rocket design that doesn't require any new technology. All they're going to be doing is using Long March 5 boosters, 3 of them to be precise, or 3 Long March 5 cores, to make a super Long March 5. That's essentially all this new rocket amounts to, and this is all they need to reach the moon. The second most important thing that I think will contribute to their success is their recent alliance with Roscosmos. The Russians may not be the space powerhouse that they used to be, but their experience in space, the number of veteran cosmonauts that they have that they can contribute to China's success will be instrumental in getting them to the moon permanently by 2027. And the consequences of all this are far more dire than just about anybody on the planet seems to realize, aside from a few military analysts who recognize just how important the moon is to the future. And there are some who may believe that China intends to use the moon purely for peaceful scientific purposes. I am not one of those people, and there is a lot of evidence to indicate that their intentions are far from peaceful, and if they are not, the consequences could be dire indeed. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well. Corrupt contractors who are looking to take advantage of one of the most underfunded departments of the U.S. government, and an unsustainable plan that is doomed to cancellation, as the Apollo project was. Something has to change, so it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. This story was actually broken several days ago by a number of agencies, foremost of which was the South China Morning Post, and it pertains to a mission called Chang'e 8, whose original intention was to set up an unmanned station on the moon by 2035. However, it's always been understood that the long-term objective of this base is to have a manned presence on the moon. As you may have noticed at the beginning of this government informational video, this is a scientific research station, or so the People's Republic of China claims. And as I said before, it was intended to be established on the moon in 2035. But Wu Yanhua, who's the deputy director of China's National Space Administration, has now stated that Chang'e 8, which is the name of this mission, will be sent to the moon by 2027, or that at least is the stated objective. The goals of this mission are innocuous, things like the 3D printing of lunar dust, which would follow in two more launches over the next few years. But there are no details as to why things have been sped up so much, why the incredible sense of urgency. That is the main concern. And a lot of observers would say, how the hell are the Chinese really going to accomplish this? I mean, they've only sent a couple of small unmanned rovers to the moon, and they did have a sample return mission that went very well. Also, how can they possibly go from not being on the moon at all to having a permanent base there in just 5 years? Well, I'll tell you something. There are a lot of things that China already has in place. An increasingly aggressive space program that seems capable of accomplishing just about anything they put their mind to. I mean, consider this. There have been 400 Long March launches in the history of China's space program. 400 rocket launches. But perhaps even more importantly than this is the fact that they are going to complete their space station this year in 2022. The Tianzhou 4 cargo spacecraft and the Shenzhou 14 crewed spacecraft are going to be launched to the station, along with two new modules, the Wenchang and the Menchang, which will complete the space station. Think about that for a moment. They only launched the first module of this station in 2021, and the damn thing's gonna be done by the end of 2022. Oh, and by the way, there's no reason to believe that the rockets that will send up those two modules aren't going to re-enter the atmosphere in an uncontrolled and frightening fashion as they did the first time. Now, this astonishing progress should teach us two important things. Number one, the Chinese are capable of accomplishing anything in a very short amount of time, regardless of whether they have reusable rockets at their disposal, which they don't right now, but the expense of expendable rockets doesn't seem to be bothering them terribly much. And number two, they're willing to accomplish their objectives no matter who they put in harm's way. They don't give a damn as to how many people they're going to risk on the surface of the planet as their second stage boosters re-enter the atmosphere in an explosive and possibly damaging fashion. Granted, nothing awful has happened yet with any of these re-entries, but that's just been dumb luck. It hasn't been the result of any kind of planning on the part of the People's Republic space program, nor obviously is it the result of any humanitarian concerns that the People's Republic of China may have. Obviously, they have very few concerns when it comes to this sort of thing. Their objectives are what matters, and the risk to human life is secondary. And I think that probably applies to their taikonauts as well. They're willing to put them at risk in order to accomplish their goals, no matter how aggressive they may be, and that gives them a dangerous edge across the entire board when we're talking about competition in space. Now, obviously, the People's Republic of China doesn't want to be embarrassed. Losing taikonauts would be an embarrassing event for them, as it would have been for the Soviet Union during a space race, but still, we have to consider the advantages that they possess as well. They've managed to put up a space station in an astonishing amount of time. They have more up-to-date spacesuits than the Western world does, and they obviously have a much greater commitment to succeeding in space, to winning this race, than the Western world does. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty certain that the majority of the governments in the Western world don't even realize that a race is happening right now, but it most definitely is. Now, here's an important detail as to how the People's Republic of China regards this competition right now. This alone should be cause for concern. Shortly after the Chang'e 5 mission brought lunar samples back to Earth, Zhang Chongfeng, and I'm probably mispronouncing all this by the way, who's the deputy chief designer of China's manned space program, referred to the United States as pushing an enclosure movement, quote unquote, on the moon. The enclosure movement was a campaign by British aristocrats in the 18th and 19th century to seize land that was formerly owned in common by all members of a village. That's a direct quote, by the way, from the South China Morning Post. Zhang went on to say that the Chinese space authorities believe that the Artemis program is designed to do something similar on the moon. Now think about that for a moment. It means that the People's Republic of China has publicly stated that the United States and its allies intends to claim the moon as a colonial possession. That is exactly what they are saying. Obviously, the Artemis program has no intention of doing this. The Artemis Accords spell it out very clearly that nobody can lay claim to the moon or its resources, but that's not how China sees it. So their solution, obviously, is to take possession of the moon before any of the rest of us can, even though this sort of race doesn't actually exist. Now, do the Chinese believe this? Are they just paranoid and think that the West is trying to grab the moon before they do? Or are they just using this as an excuse to establish their own colonial presence on the moon? Either way, it's dangerous. And consider this statement from the same article, quote, "The U.S. government and NASA have proposed the Artemis Accords to set rules for future lunar activities. Already signed by more than a dozen U.S. allies," they're very clear to point that out, "the Accords allow governments or private companies to protect their facilities or, quote, heritage sites, unquote, by setting up safety zones that forbid the entry of others. China and Russia are opposed to the Accords because this challenges the existing international protocols, including the UN's Moon Agreement, which states that the moon belongs to the entire human race, not a certain party." Does the Artemis Accords, do they really say that? Well, no, they don't. Let's go ahead and quote it straight from the source. Section 9, Preserving Outer Space Heritage. Article 1, the signatories intend to preserve outer space heritage which they consider to comprise historically significant human or robotic landing sites, artifacts, spacecraft, and other evidence of activity on celestial bodies in accordance with mutually developed standards and practices. Article 2, the signatories intend to use their experience under the Accords to contribute to multilateral efforts to further develop international practices and rules applicable to preserving outer space heritage. So what does this refer to, and why am I showing you Apollo videos right now? Well, it's because the landing sites of Apollo 11, Apollo 12, the Viking landing sites, or indeed the landing sites belonging to other countries are important from a historical perspective and therefore need to be protected. And this is not something that's going to be determined unilaterally by one country, but rather multilaterally by all of the signatory nations on the Artemis Accords. Now, was Russia or China blocked from signing these accords? No, they simply refused to sign them, and there's a very good reason for that. If they had signed them, it would have required them to consult with the other signing nations before they did anything on the moon, whereas now they're free to operate as they please. And at the same time, China and Russia are using this propaganda about the Artemis Accords to justify, quote, to effectively counter the U.S. on the moon. This again is coming from the South China Morning Post. China would have to take some forward-looking measures and deploy them ahead of schedule. They also claim that the Chang'e program plans to defeat Artemis by exploiting its weaknesses. I mean, this sounds like a military Cold War competition already, and it's barely gotten started. And again, the Western world seems almost completely oblivious. So here's China's plan as we understand it thus far. First of all, China is abandoning or at least putting on hold their more advanced future generation rockets like the Long March 9 or their Starship clone because those require new technologies that might take a longer period of time. Instead, they'll simply combine 3 Long March 5 cores, each up to 5 meters in diameter, and the rocket will be powered by clusters of YF-100K engines, which are uprated versions of the YF-100 kerosene engines that are currently used by China's Long March 5. So essentially a Falcon Heavy utilizing much more powerful engines. And this will be capable of not sending 100 tons to the moon as the Starship is intended to do, but 27 metric tons into lunar transfer orbit, nearly as much as the Block 1 version of the SLS. They will also, of course, need a lunar lander, a crew module, those sorts of things, but China has been working on that for quite some time as well. And if they seem to be behind, keep in mind, Artemis cannot proceed until Lunar Starship is human rated, and Lunar Starship has yet to even fly to orbit, nor has there been a prototype even constructed. And even though I personally regard SN8 through SN15 as being prototypes of a kind, I'm sorry, they're not Lunar Starship prototypes. These are vessels that don't have any flaps or fins, are designed to land on the lunar surface without the use of the atmosphere, a completely different ship when it comes down to it. And thus far, no prototype for the Lunar Starship has been constructed, and of course this has been held up by all of these damn lawsuits from Blue Origin and of course the restrictions from the FAA. So until all of those things are completed and the FAA hopefully will grant permission by February 28th, prototypes for Lunar Starship are still quite a ways away. In the meantime, the Chinese are proceeding forward with their plans unhindered by lawsuits from rival companies or from governmental agencies that care about environmental conditions or environmental concerns, or hell, even concern for human beings that may be unfortunate enough to be in the way of falling rocket debris. But to move past that, let's have a look at the different components of the station as they describe it. Obviously, there are modules for human use on the surface, ascent and descent modules, but initially a lot of automated stuff, an observation module, a telescope that is to say, to be used on the lunar surface, also technology verification, in other words, experimental rovers and robots that will be used to explore the lunar surface. But the different stages of construction are what are interesting to me. The reconnaissance part is already underway. The initial Chang'e missions that have gone to the moon have been in preparation for a long-term base. The Chang'e 4, Chang'e 5, and Chang'e 6 missions, along with Chang'e 7, and the Russian Luna 25, 26, and 27 missions are all intended to establish a future presence on the moon. On top of that, the construction phase will be well within the capability of this new rocket that's capable of carrying nearly 30 metric tons of equipment at the lunar South Pole, where they'll be able to take advantage of lunar water ice. Now, one thing that the South China Morning Post likes to point out is the fact that this is going to be a simpler approach to a manned presence on the moon. There will be no lunar gateway. Instead, there will be a nuclear-powered research station on the moon. It will allow visiting Chinese astronauts to stay on the moon for as long as their American peers, but only at a fraction of the cost, or so they claim. Also, there will be a mobile station, a moon base on wheels that will be able to roam freely on the lunar surface for over 1,000 kilometers, or so they claim, and the use of artificial intelligence technology, meaning that astronauts need not be present for its operation. The main thing that I'm interested in is the fact that it's going to be a nuclear-powered research station, and their stated objectives is to have a 1 megawatt nuclear reactor at this station. What the hell do you need that much power for? It's 10 times as powerful as the current reactors being commissioned by NASA, and that's the most powerful reactors that they're commissioning. What do you need 1 megawatt for if you're looking at a simple and small-scale research station? Well, I have a pretty basic answer to that, and an answer that I've given in the past. They want to use this power for something extremely ambitious, and this is a lunar mass driver. Now, perhaps they're just going to use it to catapult lunar ore off the surface of the moon without having to use rockets, which would be the most practical use of a lunar mass driver. But of course, the more frightening use of this type of technology is to use it to launch artificial asteroids at targets on the surface of the Earth. And a lunar mass driver could easily launch large enough asteroids to produce nuclear-sized explosions on the surface of the planet without any warning. Now, granted, a 1 megawatt power plant would not have sufficient energy to launch these kinds of projectiles, but still, the first lunar mass drivers, the most primitive experimental kinds that have been proposed, require only 43 kilowatts, 1/20th of the power that the Chinese are talking about for their first lunar base. I can't imagine a more effective and strategically important device than a lunar mass driver if you're going to be using that kind of power. And the long-term objective may be to have this sort of scenario in the future. An artificial asteroid, and it doesn't have to be particularly large. Keep in mind that Meteor Crater, Arizona was created by a nickel-iron asteroid roughly 50 meters in diameter. Yeah, that's heavy, but it's not unbelievably heavy. And even worse, we would not be able to detect it until it was only a few minutes out. And if it was launched from the lunar South Pole, we would have no warning of its approach because that location is not observable from Earth. It's important that we keep any Chinese base under observation, otherwise a strategic weapon of unbelievable destructive power could be created on the moon, utilizing technology that is well understood and within our capabilities today. And once again, this is what a relatively small nickel-iron asteroid did to Arizona 50,000 years ago. Imagine what something constructed out of a heavier metal, something designed to produce a larger explosion, launched from the moon with almost no warning could do to our civilization and the strategic balance of power between the People's Republic of China and their enemies. Even worse is the fact that such a weapon would be virtually impossible to retaliate against, because any missile launched against a Chinese base would have to overcome Earth's gravity, whereas anything they launched to intercept such a missile would only have to overcome 1/6 of Earth's gravity. They would have a massive advantage in the gravity well competition, one of the main reasons that the moon represents such a huge strategic advantage in any military confrontation. But even if they don't have these sorts of objectives in mind, the moon also has enormous amounts of resources, including rare metals and earths, that the Chinese already have a massive control over. They control 95% of these valuable resources that are critical to our technology, and they could establish complete dominance over these resources, especially if China decides decides to establish a manned presence on the moon first and makes it very difficult for other countries to do the same in the future. Regardless of how the Western world sees this, China obviously regards this competition as being hostile and the stakes being very high. And until the Western world starts looking at it the same way, the world could end up in a very sorry state with the People's Republic of China in a very dominant position. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy these kinds of blunt commentaries, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and I would certainly appreciate any help I can get in 2022, and there are many benefits for my Patreon supporters as well. Or just a like and subscribe, and I will be very happy. So until NASA and everybody else starts taking this threat as seriously as they should, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.